They are biting the hand that feeds them. We are on our knees.
Britain's farmers have descended on London, angry at the government's changes to inheritance tax laws. They say the government's plans could spell the end for many family farms up and down the country. Our correspondent, Alex Barker, was there.
The tractors may be small, their drivers too, but they're part of a big protest about a major issue. Protesters say these children may never inherit the farms that have been in their family for generations because of government plans to charge 20% inheritance tax on farms worth over £1 million. That's a tax farmers haven't had to pay for 40 years.
Very, very distressing for a lot of farmers out there who are completely at their wits' end. And they work 7 days a week. They're the hardest working people in the community, honestly. These farms, for the pittance they're earning, they just can't afford to come up with that sort of money to pay the tax. You know, there won't be a farm left in the country.
We've just had a wee young baby of 4 months old, and it's the future of her that we're thinking about. Obviously, we'll not be able to afford to pay the tax to keep it going for us, so it'll have to be sold.
And farmers say it's more than a family affair too, warning that Britain could go hungry without its farms.
If we get a 20% inheritance tax, we're going to have 20% more for our produce. And we're the people that are producing the stuff that they call food, which is feeding people. So the poorer people in our society are the people that are going to suffer if we have another food inflation. They are biting the hand that feeds them.
Before the election, Labour promised to give British farmers their future back. And many people in rural communities voted for Labour for the first time in decades. But now you don't have to look far to find a sign that tells you just what they think of the Labour leader and Prime Minister.
Nigel Evans is one of the former Conservative MPs who lost his rural seat to Labour.
One of the first acts of a Labour government is to turn on the farmers who provide the food. They may be asset rich, but they haven't got the money. Unless they sell the farm, they haven't got anything to pay the inheritance tax that he wants them to pay. And so they're going to have to lose the farm to pay the inheritance tax. It's ridiculous.
The government says the tax won't affect many farms. It's investing billions in agriculture and it needs the money to fund things like the NHS. But the thousands of farmers here showed what they made of that as they turned to the gates of Downing Street and made their voices heard.
I would love to see the Chancellor of the Exchequer come out here and meet the farming community, because I would suggest she has never set foot on a farm in her entire life. She doesn't understand the hours that they work, the sacrifices that they make.
It is the biggest protest this Labour government has faced since coming to power. But will the tractors gain any traction with the politicians?
Well, let's hear from some more politicians, because the issue may have played out in dramatic fashion on the streets of Westminster this week, but the row has also been brewing inside the House of Commons. Tom Sullivan reports.
In October, the Chancellor set out her plan to get Britain's economy back on track. She says she's inherited a $28 billion black hole in the public finances, and tough choices need to be made.
Finally, we will reform agricultural property relief and business property relief. From April 2026, the first £1 million of combined business and agricultural assets will continue to attract no inheritance tax at all. But for assets over £1 million, inheritance tax will apply with a 50% relief at an effective rate of 20%.
Britain's farmers will, for the first time in decades, now pay inheritance tax on their farmland. The Chancellor was clear this would not hurt the majority, just the better off.
This will ensure that we continue to protect small family farms and three quarters of claims unaffected by these changes.
But those claims are disputed, with the National Farmers Union saying 2/3 of farms will be affected, something that's been seized on by the opposition and sent back and forth across the House.
But what does he say to farmers who are facing uncertainty about their futures as a result of the increased taxes announced by the Chancellor? I am very clear that we would reverse Labour's cruel family farms tax.
glad she's raised farmers because the budget put £5 billion over the next 2 years into farming. That's the single biggest increase, unlike the 300 million, which was an underspend under the last government. And when it comes to inheritance, the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected.
Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch didn't leave the debate in the Commons either.
Farming is a vital part of the British economy.
She released this video on social media of her talking to disgruntled farmers herself.
What can we do in order to make your lives easier?
It feels like a campaign video, and maybe the Conservatives are already eyeing up how they can reclaim some of their rural strongholds with this issue in the future.
Joining me now are the farmer and former Conservative MP Neil Parish and the Chief Executive at the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, Sue Pritchard. Welcome to you both. Neil, let me start with you. The furor going on from the farming and countryside community, particularly over the inheritance tax changes. How bad is this politically for the government?
I think sort of coupled with taking £300 away from the pensioners for heating allowance, it's just snowballing. And I think what it is, it's the farming community and it's the way they support the countryside, support food, and they are part of that system. And of course, your return on capital as a farmer is about 1% if you're doing well. So every million, 10,000, putting it bluntly, how can you start paying £200,000 more a million? It just doesn't work out. And if they wanted to tax, they could have taxed perhaps the threshold of 5 million. The idea of 1 million sounds a lot to people on the street, and I can understand that, but it's nothing in farming terms, and you need sort of 200 to 300 acres to farm. I think it was Tom Bradshaw said with the big march and the meeting that this will affect 75% of farmers. And you see, I think it goes deeper, Nick. I mean, I'm not sure this government wants private business. You put all this on national insurance, employment costs are high. Not only have they taken away putting inheritance tax on, that you've got trucks that are now not going to be exempt from tax. You have got fertiliser, you've got a tax on it. Sue may perhaps like taxes on fertiliser, I don't know. But it's all going to add cost to production and make farms less profitable.
But the difference here is, forgive me, one obvious difference all over the television screens in the United Kingdom is Jeremy Clarkson put out a very simple message, Neil, and he said to the government, please back down. You've been in a government that has a history of quite a few back downs and U-turns. Do you see one coming on this issue?
Well, the trouble is the system, of election has created almost an elected dictatorship with, 400 odd Labour MPs. He'd have to have an awful lot to rebel before he'd do a U-turn. And of course, don't forget, the Chancellor at the moment, she's really big and tough, and she's taking all the tough decisions. Don't forget, this is the message of the government. What a terrible mess the Tories left, and we've got to sort it out. Now, they've created a greater mess since they've come in, but, that's life. And so this is the whole raison d'etre of this government. But I do think they really have to be very careful, not only targeting farmers but small businesses generally. The cost of business and the cost of employment in this country is rocketing, and unfortunately our overall productivity is not like Germany, and yet we're going to have the costs of Germany, and that is there's going to be no growth out of this budget. That's the one thing you're not going to get out, and the farmers definitely are going to shrink because many of them are not going to be able to survive, and it's crazy to pick on farmers.
Sue, do you think the government are going to climb down over this? I mean, they've annoyed pensioners, now farmers.
It's not looking that likely. I think this government's got a lot invested in not backing down on this issue. And I'm not quite sure if that really is the hill that the farming leaders ought to be dying on. I think when we get beyond the headlines, there's a lot that farmers themselves can do to mitigate.
We'll come to that, if I may, because I think that's a really important subject. But I just want to press you on the fact is the farmers don't make the news very often.
No, that's true.
And they are all over our screens.
Yeah.
People, I think, have begun to understand more of the challenges they face. Yeah. Would it be, do you think, significant for the farming community, notwithstanding the other issues we will talk about, if there was a climb down on the inheritance tax, would that reset the relationship with farmers?
It could, it might do, but I don't think that's not what we should be talking about right now.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come to that because I know you're very keen to talk about other
Nick,
things.
can I also say that what was interesting yesterday with the march is there were quite a lot of Londoners who'd come out to actually support us. They weren't farmers. I was talking to a lady from Croydon who had come along actually to support the farming cause. So I think when the government thinks, oh, let's pick off 200,000 or 300,000 farmers, I think they are very, very short-sighted.
I'm a farmer, and I hang out with lots of farmers, and I work with lots of farmers in the Food Farming Countryside Commission. There isn't one farming voice on this particular topic. People talk about the farming voice, the farmer's voice. There are multiple farmers' voices. Farming is a very,
and that's a problem for the farmers to get heard, isn't it? But hang on, Neil, I've got to come back to you on this point, because you know, a lot of Londoners turning out who are generally in quite high income brackets compared to the rest of the country, there are people who are using farms as a tax haven, aren't there? I mean, you're a former politician, but you're also a farmer. These people should be banged to rights, shouldn't they?
That's why I'm saying that they don't have to do a complete U-turn, but they could actually say, instead of saying 1 million, you start paying tax, I would suggest 4 or 5 million, and then you would take, I mean, much as I admire Dyson and what he does with his farms, he's got something like 36,000 acres. I'm not sure that he should have all the benefits of no taxation.
But Jeremy Clarkson would agree with you about that. Sue, I think there's a fairness element here. Presumably, you wouldn't encourage tax evaders really to be let off in any reprieve.
Absolutely not. And one of the problems that we face in Wales, for example, is there are lots of private equity, lots of new finance coming in, buying up Welsh farms in parts of the country where the majority of farmers are Welsh speaking, deeply rooted in the culture of that community. It's denuding the whole of the community, as well as taking land away from local farmers. So that is a real issue that needs to be tackled.
Well, let me move on, if I may, to your Citizens Food Summit, which you chaired in London on the same day as the protest.
Ours was planned first, just to be clear.
Well, it was good foresight, let's put it that way. Maximum impact. You chaired this event, the Citizens Food Summit. Well, we actually went and spoke to some of the people attending. So let's hear what they have to say.
Recently we voted to leave Brexit, and I think a lot of people in the general public think that why wouldn't we thought about having a more sustainable solution to a lot of things, food being one, as a result of leaving Europe. It doesn't look like we've moved in that direction. We're still as reliant on overseas imports as we ever were.
It was quite a shock to know that there's no national food policy or national food strategy. So it's different government departments handling things very differently, potentially in opposition to each other.
We just need to create a market that recognises the value of nature, the value of water quality in these farming systems. And as soon as we create that market, which governments are uniquely well placed to do, there'll be a massive influx of private money that will support farmers in doing that. And I've met a farmer who doesn't want to grow good food in nature-rich landscapes and be fairly rewarded for doing so.
So, having seen that, Sue, just tell me, what was striking about some of those comments? What struck a chord with you?
The thing that struck me about the way that the citizens have participated in this whole process is, first of all, how much they care about food and farming and health and land use and trade, even these big complicated policies that we've been told for ages people don't really care about. All they want is cheap food. And yet when you bring citizens into the conversation, as we have done over the last 18 months, it's very clear to see that people really do care about food and where it comes from and how it's produced, and they want to be involved in these really difficult conversations and trade-offs that we're going to have to make if we're going to improve food and farming, become more resilient, more secure
And
in
Andy
the future.
Cato there, who happens to be one of the stars in the Clarkson's farming series.
Yes.
But he was talking about something quite interesting. I don't know how widespread this is, but he's talking about there is not a farmer around who would not wish to be farming in a sustainable fashion. That would be driven by government policy, wouldn't it? And are governments doing that? He seems to suggest they're not.
Andy's been doing some incredibly pioneering work with over 100 farmers now, bringing food and nature onto the same patch of land. And I think what he's saying there and what he's doing in his business is demonstrating that it is absolutely possible, indeed it's imperative across the whole of the farmed landscape, 70% of the UK is farmed landscape, that we are able to both restore nature and act on the climate crisis and produce food in a much more sustainable way. So he's literally putting his money where his mouth is.
Well,
And
Neil, it's getting that balance, and I think what you've got to do is make sure that some of the very best land in the country, especially if you can produce vegetables and all, it's very diverse land then and very good quality, then you've got to make sure that you can still produce really good quality food. And I mean, it's only about 4 years ago when we had the COVID coming in, and we were relying on farms for our food. People were going to farm shops for food. It's very short-sighted all of a sudden to say, well, it doesn't really matter how much the farmers are producing. And I think what I've always wanted really is a land audit, because the other problem this government's got, and the previous one, but this one more so, is that they're saying, right, we need energy, so right, we'll have solar farms. We need
which farms are being used for?
We need biogas, and so we therefore produce a lot of crop that goes into biogas plants. All of these things compete with food and compete with farming, and also they compete with the environment as well, because some of those big biodigesters, how they crop their crops and take them into biodigesters, I promise you, is not environmentally friendly. And so the whole thing needs to be looked at properly, and we need to worry about food security. I mean, one of the first questions that Rishi Sunak said in opposition to Keir Starmer, what are you going to do about food security and how concerned are you? And he had a very evasive answer, and I think this is carrying on from there.
Is food security at risk because we'll produce less food if we do it, if you like, in this more resilient fashion?
That's not what the evidence says. So Andy will demonstrate that he can get exactly the same productivity from his partners, and there are countless other examples now around the country where people are learning fast about how to farm more regeneratively and yields are not dropping. So that's a false dichotomy. We've been doing a lot of work around land use frameworks, and this government is at last going to publish the land use framework that the previous government promised over years and didn't in fact produce. But it looks like this government's land use framework will be out now in the next couple of weeks. And what we've been arguing for, and indeed trialling ourselves in Cambridgeshire and in Devon, is a way of making better decisions about how we use all of our land. Neil's right, we've got to think about all sorts of choices on the precious land that we have available to us. But that needs some real thought, some real consideration. It needs the involvement of farmers
if you're going to
in that decision.
rewild, what you mustn't do, in my view, is rewild some of the most fertile land in the country.
But nobody's saying
some of the grade 3 and 4 land, yes, that would be works well in parts of Somerset, where Ben Goldsmith is. He's actually doing some very good job with rewilding. But I also want to make sure that we've got all the tools in the box so that we can produce food, because in the end, we'll need our cereals, our milk, our meat, all of these things, our vegetables, and we should be producing in this country, Nick, more food, not less food, and we can do it in a balanced way.
This is all against a background where potentially, if the inheritance tax laws change as it looks like, we are being told, and we don't know yet, but we are being told lots of farmers will effectively stop farming. Generations will stop farming. New entries into farming are pretty hard to persuade to go in. That's the biggest threat to food security, isn't it? And yet you're all talking both of you are talking very optimistically as if food security will not be a problem.
You're right. The problem with farming is it is very capital intensive, and so therefore, coming in
with little profit.
Coming in as a young farmer is very difficult. Now, I think the 70% of the farms are going to be, commercial farms are going to be affected by this tax. And so I think it was Minette Batters when
you disagree, Sue?
Well, I do. And I think that there's a lot of... I'm getting really anxious about the tone of this conversation for all of those farmers who really are wondering where they need to go next. What farmers need is a clear national plan for farming. They've been waiting for that for 7 years. It's now really, really urgent. And the reality is that most farmers, not all, but most farmers will be able to mitigate and adapt to this new policy. Older farmers will hand on to their children much more readily. I can take you to places where I live where older farmers are still holding the checkbook at 80 and their 60-year-old sons are struggling to lead the business
accept what you're saying,
forward.
but Sue, you can't guarantee how long you're going to live, and you can't guarantee.
Well, you can take insurance
if it's
for that.
Yeah, you can, but it all adds costs. And the point I was going to make, and I think it was Minette Batters said when she was president, NFU, in order to go green, you've got to be in the black, i.e. you've got to be making a profit.
All right.
And all this is going to do, no, Sue, you've got to accept this. What this is going to do is going to put more financial pressure on family farms, and it won't do the environment or food production any good.
Steve Reed, the Minister
and
for
that's
Farming.
what the government must wake up
Neil,
to.
you made that point. But Steve Reed, the Minister for Farming at the moment, he turned around and said, actually, this policy will encourage new entrants into farming. I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it?
It is a stretch, but I would like us to be talking about where all the money is in the whole of the food system. So we're talking about farmers and public money.
And shouldn't we be saying, by the
money.
way, what sustainable farming is? Is it 80% of our own food? Is it 70% of our food?
We need to be doing that work. We produced a report back in 2021 when we evaluated what it would look like to feed ourselves as a country more sustainably, and whether we could move to a more regenerative future and produce the food that we need
provide maybe
and
70-80% of our food.
It's about consistent with what we do at the moment, 60 to 70%, because we can't produce everything that we might want.
But then we are at the
this
mercy
country.
of climate change, aren't we?
We are.
But this report that we produced was adjusted for climate change to 2050.
What, including the floods that are taking place in Europe, where we're going to see less crops available?
Because it shows a pathway where the farmed landscape can start to mitigate those impacts. So we can grow different crops in different places.
You're agreeing
we can manage
with this?
floods.
Yeah, because I think you can manage flood, you can plant copses of trees, you can actually stop soil
Can
erosion.
you manage
so
floods?
a lot of
I mean,
that you
to
could
be fair,
done.
Neil, your government didn't have a good record on that.
Provided that
we must.
But in fairness, a lot of the problems that farmers faced in a way was the change, and there was a change and moving towards more environmental policy. So that I have no problem with, but I think coupled not only with the government is the power of our huge retailers, and that is where in the last bill that was 17 it went through the House, there were powers in there for government to look at making sure that the large retailers are giving a fair price to the producer,
and
not only the farmer for meat and milk, but the vegetable producer. And I think that is where we can do a lot more
not
work.
just retailers. There's this whole invisible structure around farming. There's one fantastic farmer I know who's known as Regen Ben said his moment of enlightenment came when he was waving away the input salesman from his farm one day, having just written out a cheque for tens of thousands of pounds for fertiliser. And he stood at the farm gate and thought, hang on a minute, who's being farmed here? And there's a whole industry, a huge industry around the farmer, which is predicated on making money out of the farmer, the input, the seeds, and then the processors at the other end, the commodity buyers. Many of the commodity businesses, the global commodity businesses, have seen their profits rocket in the last 4 years, while the rest of us have been tightening our belts. That all needs to be much more transparent, and if government set clearer guardrails, stronger guardrails around the whole of the food system, then more of the value of their work could go into farmers. Farmers want, I'll just finish this one point. Farmers want a fair price in a fair market.
But how much are consumers to blame for this? We're all demanding less costs for food.
Well, that's what the citizens have been telling us. If only they knew.
But consumers are interesting, Sue, because there is a percentage of the population that will buy organic and pay more for their food, and there's another percentage of the population will buy the cheapest they can find in the shop. Even though when you survey them, they'll tell you different. So you've always got to have in the market, a higher end market, a middle market, and I don't want a low market, but it's all part of it. And if you've got 4 or 5 children and you've got a very low income, who can blame them for buying the cheapest in the shop? But we have got to make sure. But all this, going back to this inheritance tax, look, all this is going to do is actually put more pressure on the farms financially, and less of this good work is available then for farmers to do on the environment.
I'm
and food
afraid,
reduction.
Sue, he got the last word in there for us.
I'm sorry, I'm a politician, I'm afraid.
Thank you to you, Sue, to you, Neil, for joining us here. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.